Let's say that your teacher just assigned you a paper where you had to write argumentatively or persuasively, and you had to change people's thinking about a topic. What we're going to talk about in this video, which I hope is really useful for you, is we're going to talk about the different types of evidence you might use to support your arguments. Okay? So on this next slide here, I have listed the 5 types of evidence that you might use to support your arguments that we'll talk about in 7th grade. Now, there is more formal language about each of these different types of evidence, but for a starting position, this is a good place to go, okay? So in the future, you'll learn that these things are actually called other things, but for simplicity, we're going to use normal English. And we're going to use that to speak about these 5, an expert opinion. We're going to speak about statistics. We're going to talk about anecdotes and examples. And we're also going to speak about appeal to emotion and this new thing that you've probably never heard of called conjecture. Okay? So let's move on to expert opinion. Okay, this is our first type of evidence you might use to support your position, and it's one of the strongest types of argument because you're quoting an expert. You're asking and you're giving information from someone who knows the topic really well. An expert is anyone who has a special skill or knowledge representing mastery of a particular subject. As you can see here, here's a great example of using an expert opinion to support your position. Ioannis Pavlidis is a computer science professor at the University of Houston's Computational Physiology Lab who studied the distractions in drivers. I'm inclined to believe Ioannis, even though I've never heard of this person, I've never met them, I'm inclined to believe them because they are clearly an expert. They have a computer science professor who has studied different types of distractions at the university level in computational physiology. I mean, you gotta be smart to do that stuff, right? So whatever this person says sounds really useful. So in this example, the writer has used this expert's opinion to support their argument. And there's their idea, right? So as far as you keep your hands and eyes where they should be, you're probably safe. But every time you do otherwise, it's like a pressure cooker that may blow off its lid. No. So that's just this person's view of this. And if I had written this and just said Ioannis Pavlidis said, as far as you keep your hands and eyes where they should be, etc., if I had left off his qualifications, this would be a much less convincing statement, right? So one thing you're going to want to keep in mind is as you are writing your argumentative paper, if you are including an expert opinion, it's important to include their qualifications like we have done in this example right here, okay? A great way to do that is to use a tool called an appositive. If you don't know what an appositive is, Google it and use it, okay? It's really easy to figure out. So our first type of evidence to support our argument is an expert opinion. Let's talk about another really strong way to support your position. It's called statistics. From credible resources, that's an important detail. Statistics are just any set of numerical data that has been gathered on a subject. So for instance, here we have 2 examples. In 2013, 3,154 people died in crashes linked to distracted driving, and injuries linked to distracted driving are up. Some 424,000 people were injured in 2013, and almost 10% increase in 2011. So those numbers, those statistics, support my position that texting while driving is a dangerous idea, and it's a problem for us to worry about. Here's kind of a neat one that combines a reliable source, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and statistics. 1/3 of drivers, there we go, that's the statistic, 1/3 of drivers between the age of 18 and 64 read or send texts while driving. Who reads email while driving? That's just terrible. Those people shouldn't be driving at all. Neither should be the texters. But all right, let's talk about anecdotes and examples. Anecdotes are one way you can use to support your position. And an anecdote is a story. It's just a story that illustrates your position. It's usually really quick and brief, and they're really convincing, but they're also really easy to argue against. An anecdote is really convincing because it creates like a human image on a problem that we're discussing and writing about and gives us an example. So they're convincing, but they're also really easy to argue about, because if you tell a story, then that's one person's story, and I'm sure I can find a story that's much different or opposite of that. So be careful when using anecdotes to support your position, and realize that for every anecdote, there's an anecdote or a story that's the opposite of it. So here is an example of an anecdote being used well. It's helping to illustrate a position or illustrate a problem. It only takes a fraction of a second to be distracted enough to cause a crash. A Kansas teenager crashed and flipped her pickup truck after typing a single letter text. The entire text was K. The text was never sent, and the teenager died a few days later from the injuries caused by the crash. That is a really powerful anecdote. It's a story of someone who was texting, which is a bad idea, and it's a bad story. Anecdote. Pretty convincing, right? All right, let's talk about appeal to emotion. An appeal to emotion is one way you can support your position. This means using the reader's feelings about something in order to convince them of your argument. While arguments that appeal to emotion may not be as solid as or logical, as statistics and appeals to experts, they can still be powerful. For instance, if you've ever seen commercials on the save animals, like donate 50 cents a week or something and you'll save an animal, those commercials are examples of appeal to emotion, and they are very impactful. So if you want to get crazy and watch some appeals to emotions using these two PSAs, public service announcements, you can do this. This one appeals to fear, and this one appeals to your emotion of grief, loss, or sadness. So an appeal to emotion is one way in which you can support your position. Finally, conjecture. Conjecture is a good thing and a bad thing, and it's kind of difficult to explain, but conjecture is a statement that might be true and it looks like it's true, but it's really just a guess, because after you've done your research, which we provided for you, right, in this instance, after you've done your research, you know a certain number of facts and a certain number of things to be true based on the research you've completed. And inside those facts, you can speak very intelligently about what is true because it's shown there. Conjecture is when you make a guess outside of what you know for sure. Sometimes you can go outside of what you know and not go very far, and it's fine to use conjecture to make an educated guess. But oftentimes what happens with kids is they start with one fact and they run down this crazy road and go way outside what they know to be true and present it as if it were true, and it's not very convincing. For an example, in what we've been talking about, texting and driving, if all drivers were not allowed to have their phones in their cars, then many accidents would be avoided. We might guess that. Sorry if you can hear that. That's my dog being playful over there. But anyways, we might guess that if you got rid of all drivers' phones, many accidents would be avoided, but we can't really prove it. There's just no way to know for sure. It's hard to test the absence of that. I don't think this is a bad example of conjecture. I think this is a fine example of how you might use it. Less positive examples might be just running down the road. For instance, if we talk about our example of schooling, if you see evidence that online schooling is not as effective as in-person schooling, a bad example of conjecture would be if you said, well, if we continue with online schooling, kids are not going to get as much education, and then they're going to do poorly in future classes, and then they're all going to fail out of high school, and then no one ever is going to graduate, and then everyone's going to fail, and then our whole society is going to collapse. See how I went way outside of what we know to be true? Yeah, that's a bad example of conjecture. So I'm going to go all the way back to my first slide and remind you of what we just spoke about. We spoke about 5 different ways that 5 different types of evidence that you can use to support your argumentative writing. So for instance, I can use expert opinion and statistics, which are probably the 2 strongest. I can use anecdotes and examples, which are also pretty good. And I can also use conjecture, which is not very good if I don't use it well, okay? So now that you know these different types, go back to your body paragraph in your persuasive paper and see what type of evidence you are relying on, and make sure you're using evidence well.